So I think in the initial start of this particular area, what we've done in session 1, we've looked at the definitions of human resource management, and the importance of HRM in particular within organizations, and we looked at the frameworks of HRM, in particular the Harvard model, in terms of the strategic HRM. And now HR basically looks at managing people as a resource within the organization, when it works as a part of the organization to try and overall help achieve the objectives set by the board or by the senior management. What we are looking at today is obviously learning outcome 4. As part of this that we are going to cover, will also have a reflection on learning outcome 3, which is we want to understand what are the issues which HR department actually faces in the modern day and age when we work within organizations. But at the same time, what we'll also look at is how these issues are also going to help HR develop strategies to try and counteract these issues or try and come to some solutions for these issues. So we are going to start off with learning outcome 4, which is understand contemporary issues. And then with these issues, we'll look at understanding how HR firms up a range of strategies, to counteract these issues. And these strategies would mean, when you look at within the company, the HR comes up with incentive schemes, reward schemes. They do performance management schemes, which is basically to look at differentiating, the different types of employees and their performance within their role and job description within the organization. And some of these strategies are put in place on an annual basis. Some of them are quarterly based, and some of them are on a case-to-case basis. So we will look at some of these strategies which come out of these issues which we are able to identify. Is that okay?
Okay.
Stuff. Now, what I've done is I've just switched the window, in terms of the presentation. So what I've done in today's presentation is, because this is directly related to one of your activities that you need to produce in the assignment. So this presentation, with a bit of modification that I will email to you, will actually become a part of your assignment. And the reason of putting the slide notes, as you can see in the slides, will be that you can maybe change some of this and then adopt it to, the examples that you are covering, so that this becomes a final part of your, assignment brief, or sorry, the assignment submission. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in this particular unit, just to point it out, going back to the spec sheet again, there are 3 learning outcomes which have to be done as a report. That means you will do a Word document or a written assignment. But one part of the LO is basically a presentation as an activity. So essentially what we are looking at covering today is LO4, which is activity or task 2 in the assignment brief. And this will have to be presented using a PowerPoint presentation. So you have to choose an organization. And after having chosen an organization, you have to define contemporary issues, maybe pick up 4 or 5 issues and talk about it in 4 or 5 different slides. And these slides will have to accompany some sort of speaker notes for you to be able to meet the assessment criteria for this activity. Is that okay?
Okay.
So what I'm going to do is, obviously, when I'm going to cover this up, in terms of the outcome, and then we cover the indicative content given in the spec sheet, I'm going to go through this as a presentation, and this presentation would be a kind of a ready reckoner for you to kind of develop something on your side, but only put a bit of contextualization in. That means include an organization highlighting some of these issues that we are discussing today. And that should become a part of your assignment as far as, the LO4 is concerned.
Okay.
Clear enough?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. So let's look at, what do you understand by the word contemporary? How do you define contemporary?
Contemporary more related with modern issues,
Right. Correct. But if you look at just the literal meaning of the word contemporary basically means, it is occurring at the same time, or it basically stands for that, it is something of a situation, of an issue or a problem which is currently happening, at the present times that we are living in. So the reason of having the word contemporary is basically saying that there are lots of issues or lots of different things which are happening or occurring in terms of events, within the organization from an HR perspective. But the word contemporary kind of highlights the fact that this is something which is an existing issue or a problem or an event which is happening, and this then needs to be looked at from providing attention on an ongoing basis. So contemporary, in terms of the Oxford Dictionary meaning, if we look at it, basically says, living or occurring at the same time. The event was recorded in by a contemporary historian. That means, a person or a living thing or an existing situation at any given point in time, which requires attention of HR, becomes a contemporary issue. And in some cases, when you look at prioritizing issues and things which need to be solved within an organization, some of these issues which occur over a point in time, that means they are recurring, but they are also occurring with each and every employee within the organization, then tend to be called as, contemporary issues in HR. Is that okay?
Okay.
Now, in terms of, what we look at is, the idea is to try and identify a few contemporary issues which basically occur within the organization. And what I've done on slide 1 is basically list out some of these issues, because when we look at the modern days, modern day context, what is happening is we see a lot of organizations have now become multinational organizations. They have operations across geographies. And when you are multinational in terms of operating across geographies or under the umbrella of having, say, globalization within the organization, what tends to happen is the HR policies need to adjust to meeting the local cultural requirements of the people which work within the organization. And because of these, adaptations, or because of this expansion of the organization in different geographies, what tends to happen is the HR has to adopt and modify some of their standard policies. We always hear that, within an organization, I work within the head office, or you work within the corporate office. But you also hear that a lot of employees work within the branch office or in the regional office. So there are some policies which are predominantly enacted out within the corporate office, and some policies need to be customized, localized to be enacted out in the branch or regional offices. So if we compare this situation from a context of having something as a company like, say, Tesco, and Tesco works in 12 different countries, what we do get to see is there are some of these issues which are different in different countries because of the cultural background or the environment in which the organization operates. And because some of these issues have to be, some of the policies within the organization have to be adapted to counter or provide resolution or solutions to these issues, they are then also classified as something called contemporary issues. Now, in the contemporary issues, what we look at is there are lots of things which can come in. One of the key issues could be communication. So, for example, when you look at a contemporary issue, Tesco operates here in the UK, but also operates in the Turkey, say, for example, as a country. Now, there, because of communication issues or issues related to culture, communication between employees, between departments could also be something which needs to be looked into. Resource planning. Again, when we look at certain companies and operating in geographies like Middle East or in the Far East, wherein they're predominantly, say, Muslim countries, what tends to happen is they look at Friday as a holiday, Friday, Saturday as a holiday, and Sunday is a working day in some of those countries. So these are issues which the HR has to look into, because they have to adapt their policies in terms of making sure that the the holiday and the kind of calendar which is given out in that context or in that geography is related to related and also meeting the requirements of the local culture and the people. So we look at issues like communication, resource planning. I'll get into a bit more detail, but just highlighting it on the slide here. So you have issues which is related to selection. That means recruitment and selection. We have issues which could also be looked at from a team building perspective, training and development, performance management, change and conflict management, and retention management. Now, within these broad areas are issues which HR basically encounters. So these are all areas wherein HR works. So if you see, each of this bullet point is essentially a detailed HR function. So resource planning, that means how resources are deployed, where and how many people have to be deployed in a department to do the work, what is the output coming out of it, the financial cost out of it, falls into resource planning. Now, resource planning could also be a strategy for HR. But within resource planning, you could have issues which are cropping up, which are going to be classified as contemporary issues. So selection, for example, when you look at selection, recruitment and selection as a process, we look at some of the issues in terms of equality and diversity. discrimination, which will come up as a contemporary issue. So within the recruitment process, sometimes what tends to happen is that some offices, some places prefer to have male employees or female employees in certain positions, but that leads to a bit of discrimination as far as the recruitment and selection process is concerned. So within the process of selection, which is also a strategy which HR works on continuously on an annual basis, what you get to see is that recruitment and selection has contemporary issues like equality and diversity, or sexual discrimination. In some cases, what happens is candidates with disability are kind of not favorably looked at for selection in certain roles. Or these are issues that we will discuss, which are called contemporary issues. But the idea of putting these in the bullets would be to look at learning outcome 3 and learning outcome 4 together, because the issues that we identify will become strategies strategies which HR puts in place to actually look at doing away with some of these issues and addressing some of these issues. So in case of selection, recruitment and selection, just a case in point here, what we look at is that HR typically would have a detailed recruitment policy. And that recruitment policy basically, informs the line managers or the people involved in the recruitment process, interview process, is that this is what they need to adhere to while they look at making or shortlisting and selecting a candidate for a particular post or a vacancy which has been advertised. So team building and some of these other things that we will discuss in some of the slides are just, to give you a perspective of that it covers some of these strategies, and some of the issues which arise out of these strategies are then addressed by HR using these. Now, going to, the slide, basically, here what we are looking at is the role of the HR department is primarily to adopt global strategies, and when they adopt these strategies, what they have to look at is they have to treat everyone fairly within the department when they are working as employees within an organization. So HR department is tasked with ensuring that the treatment of employees is fair and it is consistent in line with the policies set by the organization. And sometimes these are very, very important in the case of companies which are like, which have intellectual property, IP, or, which are companies like internet companies in particular, where you look at most of the knowledge which the organization has, essentially is the knowledge which is with the human resources or people which work within those roles. So when you look at companies like Facebook, Google, look at Microsoft, LinkedIn, these are all internet companies wherein most of the knowledge is contained or is basically within, the human resources which are working within the organization. So HR department in these companies has a very, very important role to be able to mediate, provide, and also look after and ensure that all the policies and procedures which are put in place maintain equality and diversity, but at the same point in time promote fairness and consistency within the organizations, so that it does not create issues at a later stage or create issues within employees which work within the organization. Now, sometimes what we do get to see is, I don't know whether you must have seen or you must have heard that what tends to happen is at the senior management level, most of the dismissals or let's say layoffs in the organization typically happen because of miscommunication, or one of the reasons identified in those cases is communication. Now, the reason why communication is highlighted is because this becomes the single most important factor which basically kind of differentiates one individual from the other in terms of their performance to a certain extent, because communication at some point in time becomes information at some point in time when process becomes knowledge. So sometimes at the senior level, what we do get to see is that a lot of employees actually hoard communication or hoard information essentially. And because of which, what tends to happen is that the whole channel of flow of this communication from top to down or from bottom to top in terms of communication gets blocked. And that is where what we get to see is that a lot of HR departments look at the concept of something called open communication. That means you have access to the line manager or various people or management within the organization if you're working at the lower levels, because information needs to flow consistently and freely across the organization, whether it's from top to bottom or bottom to top or amongst colleagues, if it is related to work and if it is related to your job description. So initiation of communication by inviting listing down of some of the challenges in the organization is a starting point when a lot of training and developments happen within the organization. So the HR managers, when they do take feedback from employees, what they tend to do is they take feedback. One of the areas in which persistently they take feedback is essentially the area of communication. That are you able to communicate freely with your manager? Do you have an open channel in terms of communication with your manager? So these are the phrases that you get to see or hear when they end up taking feedback. And the idea here is that they want a communication system to be in place which allows, it's a two-way system. That means there is processing of feedback and there is also processing of information if it is relevant to the aims and objectives laid down by the organization, and it helps increase productivity and efficiency at the employee end. So one of the areas which looks at obviously because of which issues can happen within the HR side is an area which is basically nothing but communication. And here, when we look at communication issues, they basically initiate, when HR looks at putting, say, for example, a plan in place. Now, a case in point that I've given here is that if you look at a particular restaurant, say, for example, any of these fast food restaurants like Pizza Hut and McDonald's and, KFC and all that, what you do get to see in this case is that, if there is a clear communication by the manager or the person who's leading it that we are expecting a bank holiday coming in and, we need to have supplies and other things in place to be able to cater to the increased demand. If that communication goes in time from the top management to all the employees within the organization, then the organization has enough time to react and procure some of these things which then help in meeting that increased demand over a holiday, bank holiday weekend or things like that. But if the manager hasn't communicated, and what then tends to happen is that because of the increased demand, you're not able to service customers, which leads to issues or which leads to complaints, then the whole process of blame game starts that, okay, we were never told that this is going to happen, or, we were never briefed that there's going to be an increased demand. Otherwise, we would have stocked. And so there's a constant discussion which tends to happen between, the back-end staff, which is chefs, for example, or people who are at the service desk, that, okay, this was something which was not provided to us as a part of our briefing. And that is where then it tends to become, what is called the, contemporary issue. Now, going forward, resource planning. Now, resource planning basically alludes to the fact that it is looking at recruitment as a process in general. And when we look at recruitment as a process in general, we are looking at discussing some of the recruitment issues which come up and are called, form a part of contemporary issues. So in some cases, what tends to happen is when you recruit employees in the senior position, what you tend to have is a longer probation period. So if you're recruiting a CEO or maybe somebody at the vice president, director level, what you tend to see is that the probation period within the organization is normally 6 to 12 months, because they want to be able to, kind of see that, the employee is performing, is able to understand, do a validation and take the organization forward. Now, these issues sometimes can become issues in terms of, issues of debate or content, is because if the organization starts to do well, and in that probation period, the cost of hiring or the cost of payouts to this management is restricted, the person in the management is restricted, then it tends to be an issue which leads to a bit of discrimination. Because the working of the individual has brought in some operational efficiency which makes the company do well, but having a longer probation period means that the person cannot be taken into permanent position because of the clause put into the employment contract. So this then becomes maybe a contemporary issue. The other issues that we look at is when you look at recruitment happening at various levels, what tends to happen in organizations today is that they've been asked, HR tries to maintain a policy wherein they promote equality and diversity. So multiculturalism is kind of, promoted from an aspect that we need to have people from all walks of life working within, the company. But if there is a discrimination which tends to happen at the time of this recruitment, then what we get to see is that this can become a contemporary issue wherein there is a bit of discrimination happening in terms of hiring certain types of employees or types of persons coming from a different cultural background. So resource planning is a major HR strategy, because in cases when numbers of employees in the organization increase, and at some stage, the balancing has to be done from a point of view of looking at profitability and how much of manpower costs contribute to the overheads in terms of salaries and wages needs to be consistently looked at. So one of the strategies which most senior management look at when they ask HR department to work out is they ask them to work out, the cost per head, the productivity, the efficiency, and in terms of how many employees or ratio of number of employees required, in various departments when they look at the whole concept of, resource planning or HR planning. So here again, the HR also looks at, something called, when you look at within the organization, there are, imagine a sales organization which basically has, say, 5 sales managers. But what tends to happen is sometimes you will see that all the sales managers carry equivalent targets, but some of them are able to do well, exceed the target set. And what then tends to happen is if they're consistently performing well, the organization then tends to put them into some sort of they get chosen as a favorite towards a leadership development program or a program in which they are developed as future leaders for the organization. And that is where sometimes, favorites, which are management favorites, can actually come in even though they are not performing well, and can also lead to the creation of something called contemporary issues. So resource planning is a strategy which, HR puts in place to basically look at measuring performance. From time to time, they look at, obviously the process of selection. They look at what skill sets are required to be able to perform those jobs. And in some stages, what, organizations also do, they try and include, what you call psychometric tests or tests which we have heard about, like Myers and Briggs tests, which the candidates in terms of senior recruitments are, asked to take, so that they want to know what kind of personality the person has, what is the leadership style the person has, what kind of management style the person has, and is he going to be able to conform to the rules and regulations and the policies and the culture of the organization or not? Or is he going to be able to come in and disturb the apple cart in terms of what runs and happens within the organization? So those kind of things are looked at, from a point of view of resource planning, and some of these, some of the issues within resource planning can crop up as something called contemporary issues. Is that okay so far?
Yeah.
Is that okay so far, Alex?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Now, we also look at the area of, something called selection. Now, in selection, what tends to happen is when you look at recruiting people after the recruitment process has happened, or when the recruitment process is happening, one of the key things that you look at in that process is the process of selection. And the process of selection basically involves, you go through an interview process. Once the interview process has happened, you go through certain shortlisting, shortlisting phases. Once the shortlisting has happened, at some stage, if there's an involvement of an external agency or a consultant, then, they also contribute in providing and getting hold of information like your CVs, your profile, and that leads to the process of, the overall process of selection. Now, when the selection happens, and you're starting to work within the organization, you go through something called a job description, which is given out initially as when you're interviewing for a position. But at a later stage, these job descriptions are then converted into something called job requirements. And these job requirements essentially mean that, you need to have that particular skill. Say, for example, you need to have certain skills and capabilities to be able to perform well within that job role that you're interviewing for. And from that prospect, what tends to happen is that you would see that some of these processes which are used to look at interviewing and selection of a candidate then also kind of go into things like, understanding the personality, understanding why you're looking at moving, and at some stage why you're looking at moving from your previous organization. And the flip side that the second side of this particular process that we look at is, at some stage, if employees end up leaving the organization, then what we get to see is that there's a process of exit, which happens wherein the employee cannot just leave and has to do a bit of taking over before they are able to leave the organization and are kind of relieved from their duties. So the process of exit interviews is designed. And in some cases, what tends to happen is you would see the employees need to go through an elaborate exit process, because the organization feels that they need to understand some of these issues, why is that the person is looking at leaving after a sustained period of employment within the organization, whether it is because of reasons like lack of training and development, is it because of reasons like remuneration, which is to do with the salary and the wages or incentives, is it because of recognition, or is it because of any other factor which HR is totally not being able to capture. So they need to understand all these issues before an employee is actually allowed to leave an organization in most cases when you look at modern day organizations today. So the process of exit interview actually works there. Now, the other bit that is important when you look at contemporary issues is the issue of training and development. And this is a consistently applied major strategy, which HR looks at to develop resources within the organization, to develop new skill set, and also to look at ensuring that the people working within the organization have the opportunity to move up within their roles, or get promotions or get rewarded for the work which they have been doing. Now, training and development in particular, when you look at is formulated by HR under the premises of what you call, I would say, at the time of recruitment, what they identify is when you do the shortlisting through the interview process, they end up identifying what are the areas of skills, or what areas wherein you lack those skills will need to be developed as you become a permanent employee of the organization. So in this case, for example, when you look at, say, an example of a telecom company, they end up recruiting a lot of people, fresh graduates from various universities and campuses. And some of them do not come with, say, for example, a bachelor's degree. But the idea is not to discriminate here. And what they do is they put them through the process of selection, and they do feel that they have the required skill set to qualify, to join the company. Now, once they've joined, they undergo, they've undergone the probation period. Once they've undergone the probation period, what the HR then tends to do is understand the individual's needs and puts them into some sort of a training and development program to develop them going further, because they kind of feel if you've gone past the probation period and you've been successful in terms of merging, in terms of working within the organization, then they tend to put a T&D or a training and development program in place. Now, there's sometimes some employees, when they look at being put into this particular program, get left out, or they are not able to join, for example, because of various reasons, that the job that they are into or the profile which have been, in terms of job description which has been given, is quite demanding, which does not leave any time for them to look at attending those training and development programs. And that is where sometimes you tend to see that there are issues which crop up, which basically say that, okay, every time I'm given an opportunity to look at doing a training and development program, there is something important as a project that I'm put on, and I have to choose between either or. And that means that I get left out, or I don't get the opportunity to look at training and development in particular. So those areas are areas wherein sometimes you do get to see that employees kind of end up complaining, or they go through a system wherein they end up highlighting this in their appraisals, that though I am given opportunities for training and development, but the timing of those opportunities does not suit or match my job description, because I have to sometimes choose between either going on that training or missing out on an important deadline which has been on a project for which I've been working or I've been tasked by my manager. So training and development to a certain extent becomes an issue that also sometimes you get to see that people, when they leave the organization, what they say is that I've been in the company for 5 years, but I've never been given any opportunity to retrain or reskill myself. And that is one of the reasons that I want to leave. So here, these issues are called contemporary issues, and because you are ending up leaving the organization because you haven't received any training, or your manager hasn't recommended you to undergo any training in the number of years that you work within the organization, then tend to become something called, a contemporary issue. Now, when we look at the HR strategy, training and development is a very important strategy, is because the organization wants to reduce cost, in particular on the hiring and recruitment process. So imagine if an employee ends up leaving the organization, and the costs which need to be calculated in terms of how the employee was recruited, commissions paid to the agency, and then training and development done. And then at some point in time, because the trained employee leaves that particular position, what tends to happen is it leaves a bit of a void for somebody to come in and then start performing in that role. And that is the cost when you look at, is what HR tends to calculate, that if we have trained employees which have been with the organization for a number of years, end up leaving, then to recruit a similar person with a similar capabilities and skill set and have it, undergo the whole process of being comfortable with the culture and the working of the organization would end up costing this much. And that is why what HR does is, for performing employees, or for, let's put it this way, for people working within the organizations, they do performance appraisals, and in these performance appraisals, they end up identifying areas which are areas of, gap, and these gap areas are then put into some sort of a training calendar, and this training calendar works under the overall policy or strategy of, training and continuously training and developing the employees within the organization. In some organizations, you come across a term called CPD, Career Professional Development, or a Personal Development Plan, and the HR actually puts the plan in place, which is a working document, and they put that plan in place, which works anywhere between 12 to 18 months or 18 months to 36 months, so that the employees clearly know that they are going to undergo these programs or undergo these trainings, and at the end of these trainings, they will be given opportunities to move up in the organization, or get higher responsibilities or in terms of job responsibilities within the organization. So that is why training and development is a very important strategy, but also at some stages, slippages in this can lead to creation of issues which the HR has to deal with, and because of which this is one of the very important contemporary issues that we look at. Now, the other things that we look at in terms of is that sometimes one of the other issues is performance management. Now, what do you understand by performance management? The performance management essentially talks about, if you see within the organization, what happens is, or within businesses, what happens is, you see owners, management do reviews with their employees. Now, these reviews are based on the fact that they look at giving them some aims and objectives, and towards the aims and objectives, they look at evaluating whether the employee has performed well, has been able to meet the targets or the set timelines, have been able to meet the goals. And that is where this performance appraisal actually forms, can be transformed into something called a performance management. So performance appraisal is for an individual employee, but if you have that happening across the organization for all the employees across the year, then that could be called as something, as an important function within the HR calendar, as something called performance management. Now, most large organizations, or even small, medium organizations today, have some sort of an HR system in place. One of the most popular systems that you will get to see is an Orange HRM. And that is like a CRM-based system which HR uses to try and keep performance and performance appraisal records of the employees. Now, this is finally linked into something called also remuneration, also linked into rewards, and also linked into something called the job promotions at some point in time. So imagine a number of employees within a telecom company like Vodafone going through a performance appraisal every year, and in every year what they look at is, they look at the job description, and against which how have you performed, what have you achieved, and have you met or exceeded the targets in terms of qualitative and quantitative targets set. If you are able to meet and exceed the targets, that means you're doing well, and this is going as a positive record in your performance appraisal. But at some stage, what tends to happen is, you will see that some of the employees who are even not performing well because of various reasons, medical reasons, personal reasons, or issues in terms of their work, are not able to perform, but they are still able to progress well within the organization. Now, that is where the HR puts in place, in certain positions, fairness or a fair policy system, wherein everybody within that particular job role or responsibility has to perform, irrespective of whatever conditions or circumstances. And that is where sometimes you get to see, if you pick up an example of a call center, for example, wherein a number of agents are working on making calls to the residents on PPI claims. But sometimes you get to see that, because the call automation and the call dialer facility is managed through the server, sometimes we get to see a lot of employees end up getting a lot of leads, and they end up getting a lot of rewards, and their performance appraisals tend to be superlative or superior as compared to the others who have been diligently working in the call center. So here the line manager and the HR manager have to work in line to try and see that it is not just the output on which the employees are rewarded, but also on the areas in which the employees are able to check mark or kind of meet all the requirements for the job description. That means if a call center agent is required to make 200 calls a day, the person is making 200 calls. If the person is able to give a proper introduction, follow the script, and then end the call, if the person is doing that, that's fine. If the person is on time, is able to spend time on the calls, but without having to spend too much time on certain calls, that is also considered an okay. So that way, a performance benchmark is created wherein it's not just the target that you're able to meet, which is the only criteria, but in some cases, sometimes line managers just look at the performance criteria of the target being meant that, okay, you've been able to generate 5 leads across consistently on a daily basis, and across the month you've done your lead quota. That means you're going to be you're going to be rewarded and you're going to be incentivized. But what about the others who have done all the bits but have not been able to get hold of quality leads? And in those cases, what tends to happen is that when cost benefit analysis is done by HR, when continuous feedback is taken, what we do get to see is that an average performer does not, for example, if there are slabs being created by HR in this system like average performer, and exceeding performance, then in these 3 slabs the differentiation has to be on the basis of there has to be a fairness in terms of these differentiation across those 3 types, because every time the employee is meeting the basic criteria of being either meeting the call quota or being on time and calling the customers. So performance management is a very sensitive area in HR, and that has to be looked at in great detail. And you will normally see that within organizations, when performance appraisal happens, there are a lot of policies and practices put in place which kind of clearly identify in a clinical aspect, 0 or 1, that either you meet it or you don't meet it. And because this has a direct correlation with rewards or incentives or bonuses, that is why this area has to be looked at very carefully within the HR planning process. And here the idea is that you're not the HR tries to ensure that there is no discrimination which happens when performance appraisal happens across the department or amongst a large number of employees within the organization. Looking at one of the other areas which is an important area that we look at, sometimes you get to see change creates a conflict within the organization. Like, for example, when you look at let's give you an example here of, say, Windows 10. Now, I know Windows 10 has been out in the market for a couple of years now, but most organizations, when they looked at moving from Windows 7 to Windows 10, they do find that there is, because it's a large scale, it's a very large scale change happening across the organization, wherein every employee, every PC or every system is going to be updated to Windows 10. What you do normally get to see is that because of this large scale change, which is a platform change happening within the organization, is that some of the employees are uncomfortable moving over from the old system to the new because of various factors. It could be hesitation, it could be lack of knowledge, it could be that they do not want to change at all, and it could be to a certain case, difficulties in understanding the new system would also create a bit of discontent within the employees. And that is where change, which is when it is implemented, HR always puts a long-term plan in place. So a lot of organizations which are looking at moving from Windows 7 to Windows 10, and that is happening across the organization, this as a planning process would have been put into place 12 to 15 months in advance, and this happens always in a phased out manner. And this then becomes a part of a long-term planning policy which the HR does, because it has to be looked at from a costing perspective, training and development perspective, from a perspective of purchases. New purchases would have to be made because some of the systems in the organization might not meet the criteria for running Windows 10 effectively. And last but not the least, there are various departments which participate in that kind of a change. So IT department assumes a very important role because they have to look at reinstalling or buying or purchasing or changing the systems to be able to ensure that the change is seamless, the data is not deleted, and most of the work which the employee does on the machine is still retained. So these kind of changes also sometimes, lead to contemporary issues. Another example that I would say here would be, mergers and acquisition. So when you look at two organizations combining, sometimes what you get to see is there's a conflict, and a large scale change happening is because one organization which is taking over the other kind of tends to feel that the employees in those organizations will face redundancies. So again, this process of mergers and acquisition, is a very sensitive issue, but falls, if I look at the contemporary issue which is created because of that merger and acquisition, is something called change in conflict management, and the HR has to do a lot of planning in this to ensure that there is seamless transition. No employees feel that they are going to be, left out or asked to go because there are, no vacancies, and they do not feel discriminated. So change and conflict management is one of the issues, and you have to explain this in an example of, a relevant example of either a merger or acquisition or a change coming in within the organization, which leads to the concept of, why employees do not accept change, or, what could be the areas of conflict which get created because they are not able to adjust to the new system, or, the new policies and rules and regulations being introduced in the case of mergers and acquisition. And last but not the least, there are lots of contemporary issues, but we are discussing a few. Last is the issue of retention management. Now, when you look at retention, in terms of every organization looks at retaining its employees. Reason being, they do not want to go through the whole process of recruiting, selection, training, development, and then having the employee achieve a potential which works best to produce the output or meet the aims and objectives of the organization. So here, retention management, in some cases, when you look at, could become, is obviously a major strategy which the HR puts in place. When you have employees performing exceedingly well, you know that the competition can actually approach those employees and, post them into their organizations, because they feel if you have a performing employee coming into the organization, they generally, are able to contribute much more than what and align much more better in terms of the aims and objectives of the organization. So you get to see a large number of organizations globally. The HR departments do a pact that they do not, or they will not approach employees of the organization, if they end up leaving, or they end up, kind of deciding to go to a different competitor because of, issues that they want to avoid in terms of having employees take away, some of the organizational secrets in terms of, working, or, the methodology and things like that. So you get to see, I think, I don't know whether you are aware or not, but I think last year there was a case which was settled between Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook in the US, in particular, wherein the companies had actually formed an alliance to not allow employees from each other's organization to work, within the organization they ended up leaving. And that led to a discrimination case which was filed by one of the Apple employees, which Google could not hire, and because of which he lost his job at Apple and also was unemployed for a number of months. So he filed a case in the US court, wherein the judge upheld this case, saying that this led to unlawful discrimination against the employee choosing to work for a different organization because of the pact signed, or the agreement signed between these organizations. So sometimes you get to see that organizations, what they do is they sign agreements amongst themselves, saying if you have to hire an employee from a competitor's organization, they have to be away from that organization for a period of 12 months, 18 months, even 3 years in this case. And that is a long time, in terms wherein they kind of prevent the employee from taking over the secrets or the various assets of the organization over to a competitor. But in some cases, this can be detrimental, and it can become an issue in terms of being discriminatory, wherein the employee, is not able to find genuine work and is able to work for the competitor organization from that aspect. So these are some of the, contemporary issues that we have to look at as far as the HR is concerned and Learning Outcome 4 is concerned. So some of these issues will also be looked at from a point of view of strategies which HR puts in place to look at planning, to say, for example, look at training and development, to look at enhancing the sales force, or, increasing the efficiency and productivity of employees by using the route of, training and development within the organization. So if you have any questions, obviously feel free to, drop it on the email to me. And what I'm going to do is obviously send this presentation over to you on the email. It'll also be available on Moodle if it is not already there. And that would cover the learning outcome 4 that we are looking at. In terms of the reading that I would suggest that you have to look at, in terms of there's a lot of material available, on contemporary issues in general on the internet, and obviously on Moodle as well. And I think in the book that we have, which is Human Resources Management, which is the ebook that I'm referring to, which is available on Moodle. I'm going to try and send you, a link to the pages in particular that you might want to read to get some more information and, say, for example, identify some of the other contemporary issues from that aspect, which will help you hopefully, look at doing the LO4 in a much better and complete manner. Now, just briefly looking at the ebook here for a minute, and the section. Now, in the book, obviously, it is quite detailed, and I think what will happen is you'll read some of the sections which will cover some of these issues. But in general, when we look at the ebook which is available, you have reward management, performance management as separate chapters in the book, which will form for detailed reading. But specifically pointing towards the areas wherein you will find contemporary issues will be the chapter which is part 10 of the book, employee relations in particular. And those are areas wherein you will find issues like communication, employee voice, negotiation, and employee relations in general, which will basically give you reference to the contemporary issues which come up as far as HR is concerned. The context from which you could look at would be certain times if these problems and issues are not resolvable, then the employees end up taking the ACAS route, going to a third body, outside the organizations to get a resolve on some of these issues which are done, and that will also be covered in employee relations in particular. So I think the book that we have on HRM is quite extensive. I think it's about 800 pages, but likely speaking, for this particular learning outcome 4, my suggestion would be to read, the chapter 10, which is primarily from page 753 to 71. That will give you a lot of insight and obviously cover some of these issues that we've discussed today in the presentation. So if you have any questions, do let me know. If not, then obviously what I'm going to do is try and end the session now, and then hopefully catch up with you next week to try and discuss the LO2 and LO3. And I think that will also look at concluding this particular chapter, because once we discuss the issues related to how HR strategy is formulated, that will be a starting point where you could start looking at developing your draft assignment. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that's fine. I'll take that as a yes. So thanks for joining the session today, and hopefully what I'll do is I'll catch up with you on the email, and we'll send across this particular thing to you, on the email, and point you in the direction to look at the pages on the ebook on Moodle.
All right, thanks.
Bye for now.
Yeah.